right, everyone. It is now 12:03, so I think we can begin. I want to welcome everyone to our May webinar series for Mental Health Awareness Month. We had a wonderful presentation last week explaining the details about dopamine by Jennifer Destra. And this week, I'd like to welcome a wonderful member of my team. Her name is Rachel Scarinci, and she is going to be educating us a little bit more about our inner critic. And the presentation today is how to generate alternative thoughts. A little bit about Rachel. Rachel is a prevention consultant for NJ4S Union. She is a proud first generation graduate student who will be graduating with her MPH in Global Public Health next summer. During her undergraduate years, Rachel obtained her Bachelor of Science in Public Health, along with a double minor in Science Communication and Emergency Public Health Preparedness. She is passionate about educating others on preventive strategies to raise awareness and better their well-being. Ultimately, she enjoys empowering others by giving them the tools and guidance necessary to tackle challenges confidently and autonomously. One of Rachel's favorite stories is about the lotus flower. It grows from muddy waters, but is always emerging untouched and pristine. We are all lotus flowers we are all lotus flowers constantly being reborn through the mud. It is up to us to wash away the dirt and blossom into the beautiful flowers that we are. Rachel finds joy in watching Formula One races every weekend, working on her cars, golfing with her grandmother, playing video games, and tending to her plants, while her cat, Mystic, helps. So, without further ado, I would like for us to welcome Rachel and learn a little bit more about talking back to your inner critic. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for such the warm introduction. Yeah, I think the lotus flower story was definitely something that I kind of wanted to start off today with. I think it's a very beautiful and impactful story. So that being said, I just kind of want to start off asking the question, how many of us have heard our inner critic talking back to us before? And that's an open room question. I see some chat coming in this morning. Yep, always. So yes, it seems like we're having a lot of comments coming in. Yeah, a lot of us have this inner voice that's always talking to us, right? Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, and we're just gonna talk about that inner critic and kind of how to talk back to it today. So our table of contents, again, we're going to just quickly talk about the inner critic. Then we're going to talk about how to talk back to it, how to come up with more helpful thoughts, how to manage your negative and unhelpful thoughts. Then we're going to dive into mindfulness of thoughts. We're going to talk a little bit of anxiety and stress, and then we're going to put it all together. So just to start off, the symphony of the body. So let's imagine our body is a symphony, right? Our mind and our body are always dancing together. And this harmony ensures the coordination of essential functions, maintaining balance and health in an internal spectacle. So our mind is always producing thoughts like our heart beats and our lungs breathe, right? And we can't stop our mind from creating thoughts, but what we can do is choose where we focus our attention. So the inner critic, we all have this voice, right? All of us were just talking about it. Sometimes it's talking to us about what we want to eat, what we want to wear the next day. Sometimes it's thinking, after work, what am I excited to do, right? We just have this little voice that's always talking to us. And essentially, the inner critic is an inner voice that characterizes self-judgment and shows a critical stance towards oneself. So it's a subpersonality that judges and demeans a person, driving that person towards unrealistic standards. And ultimately, this contributes to feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, depression, or increased stress. And the inner critic strives for perfection and to avoid potential criticism. So these are protective measures in place, even though it might feel harmful at times. I know sometimes for me, it feels like it's me versus the inner critic. Sometimes it's hard for me to figure out like, how do I get this voice to stop talking? And we're going to dive into that a little bit more. But it can be hard to remind yourself that this inner voice is trying to protect you, because sometimes it doesn't quite feel like protection. And it's something that develops during childhood. So the inner critic develops as a coping mechanism to navigate challenging situations. Ultimately, it's to help a child adapt to their environment, right? Because children are always receiving feedback, whether it's from their parents, from their teachers, from their peers. And the inner critic's going to internalize that feedback and then shape a person's self-conception and behavior. So again, this all develops during childhood, but as we know, it definitely carries into adulthood. And children who experience frequent judgments, ridicule, and a scarcity of positive feedback during their childhoods are much more likely to develop self-critical tendencies later on in their life. This inner voice, it simply doesn't dissipate with time, right? Again, we all said we can still hear it. So as it continues to shape into adulthood, it's really important to understand this generational muscle response. It's automatically trying to protect us any second we feel threat or danger, and that's just going to trigger your inner critic. And understanding where the inner critic's origins come from can help you manage and influence that positiveness out of it. So again, saying that it comes from childhood, what is the inner critic's purpose? So as we had briefly discussed, right, it's a protective measure to help us, but it also is a way for us to minimize potential threats. So perfectionism is something that I think a lot of us have within us, even though it's not something we might recognize. We all have our own personal standards that we're trying to achieve. None of us want to feel judgment from anyone else. And again, we have this fear of rejection, regardless if it's in childhood or adulthood. And that's something that's always going to trigger the inner critic, because that's the response to these threats. And we know perfectionism is adaptive, right? But it can also lead to anxiety, self-doubt, and burnout. So if this inner critic has really high standards and is demanding these constantly, you're going to think that you are preventing failure and criticism, but it's the harshness, like, of those thoughts and what you're doing to yourself, that we have to learn how to manage. And again, like I was saying, there are maladaptive aspects to the inner critic. While the inner critic has a lot of protective functions, it can completely tear us down to a state where we might not even recognize ourselves or the thoughts that we're having. And I think it's really important to highlight here that excessive self-criticism undermines self-esteem. When I was thinking about that, that was something that was just really powerful to me. When we are excessively self-critical, our self-confidence, our self-worth definitely plummets, right? And that's something that can hinder your personal growth, your risk-taking. And risk-taking doesn't have to be something negative, right? I think a lot of people tend to go to the negative side of risk-taking, but some positives. Say you've come this far in your life, right? And you're in your middle ages now, navigating, and say you want to take a new career path, or you want to go back to school, or you're ready just for like a new chapter. Those are all positive forms of risk taking. And when our inner critic is this negatively harsh on us, it's going to stop us from taking those risks that might really help us in the end. Something I like to do every morning when I wake up is say something kind to myself in the mirror when I'm getting ready in the morning. It's helped me go a far way with myself, and like finding that peace and love that I need within me. So yeah, positive affirmations are great. Trying to reassure myself. So yeah, reassurance is definitely something that can be very beneficial. Reassuring yourself that you're okay in the moment. Telling it to shut up. That's a great one. Yeah, no, I've definitely had those moments where like the thoughts are way too much and I make a joke that it's too loud up here. And sometimes I just grab my head and I'm like, can we shut up? Like, please just stop. So I totally relate to that. I tried to combat the lies in my head. That's a really good one. Yeah, talking back to your inner critic, you have to recognize the thought that you're having and where that thought is coming from. So we can be kind to ourselves when we're combating the lies in our head, right? It doesn't have to be a harshness on ourselves. We can still learn to be kind, and we'll learn that as we move on. Trying to reassure myself with the facts and positive affirmations. That's beautiful. Are these thoughts rational? That is great. And you've already stolen a piece of my presentation. Yeah, trying to think logically. And I see more self-affirmation. So, wow, you guys are already hitting the nail on the head. So, now that we've talked about that, let's dive into it a little bit. So there's a couple of different ways you can talk back to your inner critic. The first one is simple, just recognizing that you're even having an inner critic or this inner voice that may or may not be being harsh to you. So once you start by recognizing when your inner critic is speaking, the self-critical thoughts, they're going to calm down or they might come up. Sometimes when I recognize that I'm having a thought, it makes it easier for it to go away. But then sometimes I start, having the thought and it amplifies. So self-critical thoughts might include phrases like I'm not good enough or I always mess things up. Sometimes the inner critic is more than I'm not good enough. Sometimes the inner critic replays past events that might have occurred, right? So, for example, say you overshared something with someone, and now you go home at the end of the day, and this inner voice is just in your head, like, I can't believe that I said that. I can't believe I overshared. I can't believe I was too comfortable. Just recognizing that you're even having those thoughts to yourself is a big step. Next, you can practice self-compassion and self-acceptance to help counteract the harshness of the inner critic. So try treating yourself with kindness and understanding. Imagine how you would respond to a friend who is struggling. Extend the same compassion towards yourself. Sometimes it's really easy for us to take ourselves out of our own shoes and think, if this was a friend or family member, even a coworker, if it was just someone I cared about, like, how would I talk to them? How would I show them compassion and understanding for their situation? Try to have that same understanding and compassion for yourself. And just remember that everyone makes mistakes. It's okay to be imperfect. For me, when I was younger, I did competitive snowboard cross, and I think what made it so comfortable, I was really scared of playing sports when I was younger. I remember my mom, she put me in a sports camp, and it was at the YMCA, we did it like a whole summer. I come back, my mom goes, "What was your favorite sport?" And I go, "The one where they don't chase you with the ball." Right? Because I was scared of the judgment from everyone else. Like, oh, like what if I accidentally can't catch the ball and now my whole team is placing judgment on me. So when I started learning how to snowboard, I felt very comfortable because even the professionals fall, right? When we watch the Olympics, how many times have you seen a snowboarder on the half pipe and they don't land a trick? And I think that's why skateboarding was something that I wanted to pick up as well too, because even playing golf with my grandmother, we watch PGA and Live Golf all the time, and like even professionals can't swing a golf club sometimes. So I think for me at least, when I was having self-compassion with myself for sports and things that I enjoy, it made it easier for me to find peace in sports where I guess other people failed as well, or I saw professionals fail, because I was just really scared of that. Um, the next thing you can do to talk back to your inner critic is practicing mindfulness. That's something that you just are becoming aware of your thoughts without judgment. And you have to accept that negative thoughts will always arise, but you don't have to believe them. And you can observe them like passing clouds and let them go. I know some of you have mentioned that you practice mindfulness already. I think something that I had learned when I first started working here, I went to a workshop for shadowing, and I was really interested to hear we always start our days off so busy, and I think it's a really important thing for us to start our mornings with a moment for ourselves. So I know for me, when I'm getting ready in the morning for work, whenever I get to work, I just like to take a minute for myself. And a minute might seem like a short amount of time, but doing nothing for a minute is actually quite a lot of time. And it's a really I think it's a good idea to start each morning off just with that breath of fresh air, right? Just being mindful of the day, of my thoughts, recognizing anything that I might have woken up with, any anxieties, any stress, any doubts, and just clearing that before my day starts. It helps my inner critic a lot. Um, Something else with mindfulness that helped my inner critic was when you're having a thought that's very overwhelming, the best way is to just sit with the thought, recognize you're having the thought, and thank yourself for the thought. Thank yourself that it's not important right now. I understand it might have been important before, but it's not something we have to worry about. Just thanking yourself and having that compassion in mindfulness as well. So, the fourth way you can talk back to your inner critic is by setting realistic expectations. Again, just understand that perfection is unattainable, right? When I was in high school, my music director, he never gave, I was a band kid, and we always had to do some kind of instrumental test where we played the instrument, we had to do scales or memorize something. And whenever we did those performance tests, my band director never gave anyone 100 because he didn't believe that anyone could do it perfectly. He goes, I'll give you a 99, I'll give you a 95, I'll give you a 98, but you're never going to get 100 from me. And I just thought that was interesting, something that, that was in high school. And that's something that I still remember and I still think about because I know I live my life to like a very perfect T. And when I have all my ducks in a row and when one of my ducks goes missing, I freak out. And that was just something that I took with me of like learning it's okay. Not everything has to be perfect the first go through. Sometimes we're put in situations that we've never been in before and we just have to learn from them and take that into account as we move forward in life. And lastly, you can reframe your inner dialogue by replacing negative self talk with more realistic statements. So, this is changing how we talk to ourselves, right? We can't get rid of our thoughts, but we can generate more helpful and realistic thoughts. So, for example, say your inner critic is telling you, I'm a failure. You can challenge that by saying, I've faced challenges before and I've learned from them. I can overcome this too. So again, that was kind of what I was talking about, I guess, with the practicing mindfulness and having a little bit more compassion for yourself, just recognizing that thought and saying, you know what, I appreciate my mind and my body reminding me of this thought because it was important at one point, but it's just not important anymore. And again, too, even if you are in that pit and you're, down bad and you're like, wow, I am a failure, challenge that thought. You have been through other challenges before. Some of our challenges might feel greater than others, but I think, when it comes to you, you can compare your challenges with what you're currently facing and see where it stacks up. So, crowd questioning is a form of questioning that invites you to deep dive into your own thoughts. It helps you engage in more effective ways of thinking about a situation. And this approach is helpful because it invites perspective taking and helps us connect with more reasonable, rational lines of thought instead of focusing on illogical or emotional based thoughts. So, through Socratic questioning, you can explore complex truths, seek the truth, open up regarding issues or problems, uncover assumptions, distinguish what you know from what you don't know, and follow through on logical lines of thought. So, Socratic questioning can look like this. At first, you're going to ask yourself, is this thought realistic or is this based on fact? Once you've asked yourself those questions, then you can move on to asking yourself, am I basing my thoughts on facts or feelings? Then you can ask yourself, what is the evidence for this thought or am I misinterpreting it? Then you can ask, am I viewing the situation in a black and white way when it is more complex? And lastly, if I were in someone else's shoes, How would they think about this? So this line of questioning is really a way for us to ask ourselves about our thoughts, right? And learning if they are illogical or if they are rational. When we ask ourselves these questions, it allows us to see the thought from an outside perspective. So I'm someone who always plays devil's advocate because for me growing up, it was always really important to understand a situation from everyone's viewpoint. I never wanted it to see a one-sided view or a biased view. So for me, Socratic questioning was something that really helped. Has anyone used this form of questioning before? Some parts of it. I'm getting some responses in the chat. So yeah, I've definitely used some parts of it before. Before I had learned all about Socratic questioning, I always used to ask myself, is this a realistic fear that I'm having, or is it based on like something that is not true? Sometimes I'm trying to think of an example, but like, oh, someone else said always, always number four. Yeah. So, right, thinking about the situation in someone else's shoes. So, if there's one question that works for you, maybe you don't have to use all these types of questioning, but these are still a good basis to have. Even if you wanted to have them written down in a journal, and you could just open the journal and you don't even have to write, you could just ask yourself. I know not all the time we have the space for, sitting down and writing out everything. Sometimes I just need like a quick fix. And asking these questions to myself gives me that quick relief that I'm looking for. So, another way to manage negative, unhelpful thoughts. So this would be on a piece of paper. I tried to make it look like how it would on a piece of paper. So on the top, you would write the negative thought that you're having. You would draw a line underneath the negative thought and then a line down the center of the page. On the left side of the page, you would have evidence for this thought. And on the right side of the page, you would have evidence against this thought. If the evidence in the evidence against this thought column is larger than the evidence for, it's safe to say that it is just an unhelpful thought and there is no basis for it. So this is a really good way for someone to essentially visually see the evidence for the thought and against the thought. Oftentimes when I do this, the against column is a lot larger than the for column, because a lot of it's not true. They're all self-doubts that I might be having or self-concerns. It's not a fact from anyone else. I just thought this was something that can really help you navigate in a different way if you're more of a visual individual. Um, and when we experience pain, it's important to turn towards ourselves rather than against ourselves in order to cultivate a more compassionate, loving response to ourselves. And again, this exercise is just really helpful when you don't want to reinforce your inner critic. So just real quick, the mind and thought. So our thoughts are always swirling around in our minds. Sometimes we have intrusive thoughts, which are completely unwanted. They can feel like they are consuming our mind, and the more we try to get rid of them, the more they appear. For me, there was a period of time where I was able to escape my thoughts during the day, but when I went to sleep, my dreams were all the thoughts I was putting off during the day. So I guess while I had peace of mind during the day, that was a rough night's sleep. And then waking up in the morning, having to deal with that and carry my sleep dreams with me, like what happened to me in my dreams, was tough. So again, the more we try to get rid of them, the more they appear. It's not something that you can just like switch off a light switch and it's gone, it's done with. So with this mind and thought, we're going to dive into, oops, sorry. we're going to dive into mindfulness of thought. So I know some of you have already expressed that you practice mindfulness, but I just wanted to dive into it a little bit. So by simply acknowledging you're having a thought, it becomes like any other thought you have. We become aware that our thoughts are simply just thoughts. So the thought of, I'm not good enough and I want peanut butter are exactly the same, right? They're just a thought. But the thing is, one has feelings and negative emotions attached to it, giving it more power. So when we say, I'm not good enough, right? That's definitely coming from a place of either inside of us because we think that ourselves, or we've heard it from an external source. And that triggers a cascade of emotions that come with it. And it just gives it so much power than when you tell yourself, I want ice cream, or I want this, or I want that. So just keeping that in mind as well, that when you acknowledge your thoughts, it can become like any other thought. It just takes practice. So, quickly, stress explained. Sometimes when a challenging event occurs, it triggers a bunch of emotions within us, causing our minds to quickly stir up thoughts in order to cope with the challenge. This is where the inner voice starts to become noticeable, sometimes unbearably loud, especially when we don't know how to control it. As we know, stress plays a really big part in activating the inner critic. Unfortunately, our brains have a hardwired negativity bias, which means that our automatic thoughts are often pretty negative. We tend to see the glass half empty instead of half full. When an event occurs that causes your thoughts to stir and that inner voice starts talking to you, we just tend to immediately start thinking of the bad things that will come. And when we don't tackle the problem, it only raises the stress and anxiety, allowing our inner critic to run the show. And if we've learned anything so far, we know we don't want to reinforce the inner critic. So, just to quickly jump into anxiety, anxiety and the inner critic, they go hand in hand, similar to stress. When the inner critic becomes overly harsh, it can trigger anxiety, and negative self talk intensifies during stressful situations, amplifying anxious thoughts. So, this was just a little example that I had been taught when I was in therapy. My therapist had said to me that anxiety is future focused and it triggers your internal threat system. So she said, your body is acting like a tiger is chasing you, but that's not the actual situation that you're in. And I just thought that was something that was really powerful to me when, like when I was first going through and dealing with all of this, because I didn't know how to explain my anxiety. It does feel like a tiger is chasing you. It feels like a life or death situation, but that's not actually what's happening, right? It could have just been I dropped my spoon and yogurt got on the counter. And I'm like, oh my God. Like, and you're acting like a tiger's chasing you. But for what? You just dropped a spoon on the counter. So recognizing, as we've been talking about, recognizing these types of thoughts, we can help change it, right? So sometimes the inner critic and anxiety, when they're tied together, it can sound like, who do you think you are to achieve that goal? Because you're going to fail. Or it can sound like, what are they thinking about me? Did I do well enough? Did they like it? Do I fit in? Those kinds of thoughts where the inner critic and your anxiety are tied together can become very overwhelming. But again, a tiger is not chasing you. You are safe in the moment, and that's something you have to work on recognizing to find some sort of reprieve and calmness, right? So, this was a graph that my school social worker drew for me when I was in high school. And it's talking about when we don't deal with stress or anxiety head on, what happens to us. So as you can see, it starts off with the blue zone. The blue zone represents a spike in anxiety, but it's able to go away. As you can see on the graph, there's, a spike, but then it goes down pretty much back to normal, but not quite normal. When we don't deal with a situation, right, the thought is going to trigger the inner critic, and then that's going to trigger the anxiety. So you're going to have this spike. But if you keep putting it off, it's going to keep building and building and building. So when it keeps building, and again, too, say in the blue zone, you have this thought, right? And you're like, oh my God. But then you're able to calm down. That is still a good thing. But it will continue to build, right? And that's what the yellow zone shows, that you're having a spike in anxiety, but now it's starting to linger, right? You're not really feeling back to normal. You have the thought and it stays there. It might go away, but you're still kind of thinking about it. And therefore, there's still this higher level of anxiousness inside of you. Then it continues into the orange zone, which represents a spike in anxiety, but now it is noticeable. You're recognizing that you're constantly anxious. Everything is a trigger for you. You're feeling all these emotions, and it's just you keep feeling these spikes, but when it lowers, it's not lowering much at all. And then eventually you end up getting to the red zone, which is nonstop anxiety that is constant to the point that it's almost unbearable. So now you're just going to end up plateauing, right? Because there is no more spike in the emotion. It's just at such an all-time high that you're not able to come down from that. And for me, I think when she was explaining, so I think I was trying to have a hard conversation with someone in high school, and I kept putting off having the hard conversation with one of my friends. And she was saying, she's like, for right now, you're in the blue zone, right? Because you think about having a conversation with your friend, and then you tell yourself, I'm not going to do it. So then you feel normal. But then you move into the yellow zone because you think about having that conversation with your friend. And when you tell yourself, no, you know you need to do it. And now you're not down here at normal anymore. You're hovering right above it. And then you think about it again, and you keep moving and building and building and building until you're just at this plateau of anxiety and inner critic voices talking to you, and you just can't get away from it. Um, I just really wanted to share this with you all. I thought it was a very powerful visual for explaining what happens when we don't deal with our stress and anxiety. And that always ties back into the inner critic and the inner voice that we have. So just putting it all together, again, just having self-compassion for yourself to counteract the harshness of the inner critic, practicing mindfulness to become aware of your thoughts, reframing your inner dialogue to be kind to yourself and accepting of your thoughts, and then practicing the Socratic questioning to generate more helpful thoughts.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And for everyone watching, if you enjoyed the presentation and you want to keep up with what NJ4S Union has going on in the community, please follow us on our social media page. It is at NJ4S Union. And if you have any questions about our programs, please send us an email at NJ4SUnion@preventionlinks.org.